There is a particular silence that spreads through the galactic assembly when something impossible is spoken aloud. I remember that silence clearly. The chamber itself is vast beyond human comprehension, a cathedral of stars and steel suspended in the void between empires. Thousands of species have gathered there for centuries, warriors born under crushing gravity, minds evolved in methane seas, civilizations that measure time in geological eras. And yet, on that day, every one of them sat in uneasy stillness, because the reports from the Orion frontier had begun to arrive. At first, they seemed insignificant. A missing fleet, then another, then a third. The Assembly has seen fleets vanish before. Space is dangerous even for advanced civilizations. Stars explode without warning. Ancient weapons drift through forgotten sectors. Even the most disciplined armada can be lost to chance. But patterns are something else entirely. I was the one tasked with analyzing them. My species has always excelled at recognizing structure within chaos. Wars follow predictable curves. Empires rise through resource acquisition. Conquest is a science, simple, brutal, efficient. Or, at least, it used to be. The first fleet sent to Earth should have returned within 2 cycles. It did not. The second fleet vanished after entering the same system. Then the third. By the time the fourth armada disappeared, the Assembly could no longer ignore the anomaly. A death world had swallowed 4 invasion forces. That alone should have been impossible. Earth's classification file was laughable compared to most galactic powers, a primitive species divided into hundreds of competing factions, technology barely advanced enough to sustain orbital infrastructure, a population constantly fighting itself over borders, ideology, and resources. Strategically speaking, humans were chaos. Biologically speaking, they were fragile. And yet, every empire that attempted to conquer them had failed to return. When I first presented these findings to the Assembly, many dismissed the data outright. Mechanical failure, one strategist suggested. Unstable solar phenomena, another argued. A third delegation proposed piracy. All reasonable theories, but none explained the deeper anomaly. Because the fleets had not simply vanished, their targets had changed. I began comparing reports from nearby systems, worlds that had interacted with humans after the failed invasions. What I discovered disturbed me far more than the missing armadas. The planets near human territory were evolving, not biologically, civilizationally. One mining colony that once served a rigid imperial economy had reorganized itself into a decentralized trade network after brief contact with human merchants. A militarized border world that had spent centuries locked in Cold War with its neighbors had suddenly signed cooperative defense treaties after human diplomats arrived. Another civilization had adopted human engineering techniques that allowed them to rebuild their collapsing infrastructure in less than a decade. At first, these seemed like isolated coincidences, but the deeper I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Wherever humans went, everything changed. Empires that had been stable for millennia began adapting new political systems. Trade networks expanded beyond traditional monopolies. Even ancient rivalries, conflicts older than human civilization itself, began dissolving. And the strangest part, humans were not conquering any of these worlds, they were being invited. When I revealed this to the Assembly, confusion rippled through the chamber, because our understanding of power has always been simple. You defeat your enemies, you claim their territory, you enforce obedience. That is how civilizations grow. But humans did none of those things. Their fleets were small compared to imperial armadas, their weapons were powerful but not exceptional. Their population was impressive, yes, but hardly overwhelming by galactic standards. On paper, humanity should have been insignificant. Instead, their influence was spreading faster than conquest fleets ever could. An elder strategist from the Dominion rose during the session. His species had ruled dozens of systems through sheer military dominance. His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who understood war better than most. He said slowly, "Perhaps we are misinterpreting the situation." The chamber listened. "Perhaps the humans are simply using a different strategy." A murmur passed through the assembly. The strategist continued, "If they cannot conquer through force, they may be conquering through influence." At the time, many dismissed the idea. After all, influence cannot destroy fleets. Influence cannot defend planets. Influence cannot stop an invasion. Or so we believed. But the evidence in front of us told a different story. Because the fleets sent to Earth had not been destroyed in open battle. They had entered the system expecting a quick victory. And none of them had ever left. Not one distress signal. Not one wreckage field. Just silence. Which meant only one thing. Something happened on that death world that none of our military models could explain. Something powerful enough to erase entire armadas without leaving a trace. And yet, somehow, humanity continued to spread through the galaxy not as conquerors, but as partners. Even now, cycles later, I still remember the final question asked that day in the assembly. A young delegate from a newly spacefaring species stood and spoke with visible uncertainty. "If humans are not conquering worlds, then what exactly are they doing?" they asked quietly. At the time, none of us had the answer. But we would soon learn something far more unsettling. Humans were not interested in conquering the galaxy. They were interested in changing it. And once that process begins, it becomes impossible to stop, even for those who rule the stars. The deeper we investigated humanity, the less sense the species made. In the Galactic Assembly, contradictions are usually easy to resolve. When a civilization grows powerful, the reason is always visible. Superior technology, overwhelming numbers, strategic brilliance, or ruthless efficiency. But humanity possessed none of these advantages. And yet, they continued to survive conflicts they should have lost. After the events surrounding the vanished fleets near Earth, the Assembly authorized a full investigative archive sweep. Every species operating along the Orion frontier was ordered to submit records of human encounters, military logs, trade agreements, diplomatic exchanges, even intercepted communications. Within 3 cycles, the archive chambers were overflowing with data. I was assigned to analyze it. At first, the findings appeared almost disappointing. Human warships were ordinary. They were sturdy vessels, yes, built with thick hull plating and redundant systems that made them frustratingly difficult to destroy. But aesthetically, they lacked the elegant precision of advanced alien engineering. Their weapon arrays were powerful, but nothing that surpassed Dominion plasma lances or Cathari gravitational cannons. Their fleets were also smaller than expected. Most empires measure power through massive armadas, thousands of ships moving in rigid formations under centralized command. Human fleets rarely exceeded a few hundred vessels. On paper, this should have made them vulnerable. Statistically speaking, humanity should rank among the weaker interstellar powers. Yet every battle report told a different story. Not one species had managed to truly defeat them. The first example came from a conflict known in the archives as the Helios Containment Campaign. A technologically superior empire had discovered a newly established human colony on a mineral-rich planet orbiting a yellow star. The colony was young, barely a decade old, and poorly defended. The empire assumed the situation would be simple. They deployed a fleet 3 times the size of the colony's defensive forces and initiated orbital bombardment. Within hours, human defense satellites were destroyed. Within a day, the planetary shield grid collapsed. From every conventional military perspective, the battle was already over. Victory was inevitable. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of surrendering, the colony reorganized itself. Factory complexes that once produced agricultural equipment began manufacturing ship components. Mining drones were converted into autonomous combat units. Civilian transport vessels were refitted as attack craft. The transformation occurred with frightening speed. Teachers became engineers. Farmers became drone operators. Medical technicians learned to repair Starship reactors. Entire cities reorganized their infrastructure within days. From orbit, the invading fleet watched an industrial civilization reinvent itself in real time. They still won the battle. Human defense ships were destroyed. Orbital bombardment forced the colony to surrender. From a purely tactical standpoint, the Empire achieved total victory. But the war did not end, because the humans had already begun adapting. The moment the colony fell, human forces from neighboring systems responded not with a traditional counterattack, but with something far more complicated. Supply lines were disrupted by civilian merchant fleets. Communication satellites began broadcasting human encryption protocols that interfered with Imperial command networks. Small human strike groups attacked isolated patrol vessels and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. It was not a conventional war. It was erosion. Month after month, the Empire's logistical advantage slowly collapsed. Fuel depots were sabotaged. Navigation beacons disappeared. Entire trade routes became too dangerous to travel. And then something even stranger happened. The Empire's own border worlds began communicating with the humans. At first, it was simple trade: food shipments, medical supplies, basic equipment. Then came technical exchanges. Engineers from both civilizations began sharing industrial designs. Within 2 years, the very systems that once supported the Imperial invasion had quietly integrated into human-led economic networks. By the time the Empire attempted to launch a second offensive, their own border planets refused to participate. The campaign ended not with a decisive battle, but with a treaty. The humans returned the captured colony. The Empire gained trade access to multiple human systems. Officially, both sides declared victory, but the Assembly analysts reviewing the records understood what had truly happened. The Empire had conquered a world, and humanity had conquered the situation. This pattern repeated across nearly every recorded conflict. Another report described a border war between humans and a species known for their ruthless military doctrine. Their fleets dominated the opening battles, destroying multiple human outposts in rapid succession. But as the war dragged on, human diplomats began contacting neutral systems near the conflict zone. They offered infrastructure support, agricultural technology, medical aid. Gradually, those neutral systems began supporting the human side, not through military intervention, but through economic cooperation. Supply routes shifted. Resources flowed towards human territory. The enemy fleets began experiencing shortages. 3 years later, the war ended with a ceasefire, not because humanity had destroyed the opposing empire, but because continuing the conflict had become economically impossible. Again and again, the same outcome appeared. Humans rarely won the first battle, but they almost always won the final outcome, which raised a question the Assembly had never considered before. What if victory itself was being misunderstood? For most civilizations, war is a contest of destruction. You eliminate the enemy's fleets, you occupy their worlds, you force surrender. But humans seem to treat wars something different. To them, conflict was not simply about defeating an opponent, it was about reshaping the environment around that conflict. Their enemies didn't just lose battles, they changed. Former rivals became trading partners. Enemy soldiers were recruited as security forces. Entire star systems that once opposed humanity eventually joined their cooperative networks. I remember the moment I finally understood the pattern. It was buried within a diplomatic transcript from a human ambassador speaking with a defeated admiral. The admiral asked the obvious question: if you had the ability to destroy our fleets, why did you not simply do it? The human ambassador responded with something that unsettled every strategist in the assembly.
because destroying your fleets would not solve the real problem. The admiral demanded clarification, and the human gave a simple answer. The real problem wasn't your ships, the ambassador said. It was the system that convinced you we had to be enemies. When I finished analyzing the archives, I presented my conclusion to the assembly. Many delegates rejected it immediately, because accepting the truth required abandoning one of the galaxy's oldest assumptions. Power had always been measured by territory, by military strength, by how many planets you could control. But humans seemed to measure power differently. To them, the true measure of strength was not how many planets obeyed you, it was how many planets changed because of you. And that realization led to an even more disturbing conclusion. Because if influence spreads faster than conquest, then humanity's expansion had already reached far beyond their territory, long before the galaxy realized what was happening. Which means something else was also becoming clear. Humans didn't simply refuse the rules of galactic power, they were quietly rewriting them, and the rest of us had only just begun to notice.
To understand a species, you must first understand the world that created it. This principle is one of the oldest doctrines in xeno-civilization studies. A planet's environment shapes everything: biology, psychology, social behavior, even the way a species thinks about survival. Peaceful worlds produce peaceful civilizations. Stable climates produce stable governments. Predictable ecosystems create predictable minds. So when the Galactic Assembly turned its attention toward humanity's homeworld, most of us expected a simple explanation. Perhaps Earth was a resource-rich paradise. Perhaps its environment provided unique evolutionary advantages. Perhaps its ecosystems encouraged cooperation. Instead, we found a nightmare. The first survey images alone caused several delegates to question whether the data had been corrupted. Earth's gravity was significantly higher than most habitable planets in the Assembly database. Its tectonic activity constantly reshaped continents. Its oceans produced storms powerful enough to devastate entire coastlines. Volcanic eruptions could darken the atmosphere for years. And the life forms? The life forms were worse. Predators dominated nearly every ecological tier. Massive carnivores hunted across land and sea. Venomous organisms evolved chemical weapons capable of paralyzing prey within seconds. Even the smallest microorganisms carried biological compounds that could devastate alien immune systems. Several visiting researchers required emergency medical evacuation after brief exposure to Earth's biosphere. Yet the most disturbing feature of the planet was something far more subtle: the atmosphere. Earth's oxygen concentration was dangerously high by galactic standards. Oxygen accelerates combustion reactions, something most advanced civilizations learn to regulate carefully. On Earth, the atmosphere itself made fire easier to create, which meant the planet was not only biologically dangerous, it was chemically volatile. Civilized life should not evolve in such an environment. Planets like Earth typically produce simple organisms locked in endless cycles of predator and prey. Complex technological species require stability. At least, that was the assumption our models had always followed. Humanity shattered it completely, because not only had humans survived this world, they had mastered it. When we examined their evolutionary history, the pattern became clear almost immediately. Earth never stayed the same. Ice ages covered continents in glaciers before suddenly retreating. Forests expanded, collapsed, and regrew. Predator species evolved rapidly, forcing prey species to adapt or disappear. For most life forms, this level of environmental instability would have been catastrophic. But humans responded differently. They adapted. When the climate changed, they migrated across continents. When predators hunted them, they created tools. When resources vanished, they invented agriculture. Over thousands of years, humanity developed a survival strategy unlike anything seen elsewhere in the galaxy. They did not wait for the environment to stabilize. They changed the environment themselves. Fire became their first great equalizer. With it, they could reshape ecosystems, cook dangerous food, and survive freezing temperatures. Then came agriculture, then metallurgy, then industry. Each step allowed them to bend the rules of their world just a little further. And because Earth never stopped changing, humans never stopped adapting. Every generation faced new challenges. Every challenge forced new solutions. The result was not merely technological progress, it was psychological evolution. Humans became a species that expected problems, that anticipated disaster, that assumed the future would be uncertain. Most galactic civilizations evolve in stable ecosystems where long-term planning dominates decision-making. Their institutions become rigid because their environments rarely demand rapid change. Human systems never had that luxury. Their governments rose and fell constantly. Their economies expanded and collapsed. Their cultures reinvented themselves across centuries. From an outside perspective, it looks chaotic, even primitive. But when viewed through the lens of evolutionary survival, the pattern becomes obvious almost immediately. Humans are not designed for stability. They are designed for adaptation. I remember presenting these findings to the Assembly's Biological Council. Many were deeply uncomfortable with the implications, because the conclusion was impossible to ignore. Humanity's greatest advantage was not their technology, it was their relationship with chaos. Where other species fear unpredictability, humans expect it. In fact, they prepare for it. Their military doctrines emphasize flexibility over rigid command structures. Their scientific institutions encourage experimentation rather than preservation of tradition. Their economies are built around constant innovation. Even their political systems, confusing as they often appear, are designed to evolve over time. To many alien observers, this behavior appears reckless. Why allow systems to change when stability ensures survival? But that perspective only makes sense on stable worlds. On Earth, stability has always been temporary, which means humans evolved with a fundamentally different worldview. To them, change is not a threat, it is an opportunity. This realization forced the Assembly to reconsider something we had long taken for granted. For centuries, the galaxy believed that Death-world species would struggle to achieve advanced civilization. Harsh environments should limit development, not encourage it. But Earth had produced the opposite outcome. Its brutality had forged a species uniquely capable of solving impossible problems. And once that species reached space, they encountered a galaxy filled with civilizations that feared disruption. Civilizations built on ancient traditions, rigid hierarchies, economic systems that had not changed in millennia. To humans, those systems must have seemed strangely fragile, because humans understood something the rest of us had forgotten. No system lasts forever. Eventually, something changes, and when that moment comes, survival belongs to the species that can adapt fastest. Which is why human expansion across the Orion frontier never followed traditional imperial models. Their alliances shift, their technologies evolve rapidly, their strategies change mid-conflict. Other species see this unpredictability as weakness, but humans see it as preparation. Preparation for a future that cannot be perfectly predicted. The longer I studied Earth's history, the more unsettling the conclusion became. Because the galaxy had spent thousands of years refining systems built for stability, humanity had spent thousands of years surviving instability. And if those two philosophies ever collided on a large enough scale, the outcome might not favor the species with the largest fleets. It might favor the species that had practiced adapting to chaos for their entire existence. Which means the galaxy may have misunderstood humanity from the very beginning. We thought they were a young civilization still learning the rules of interstellar power. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if humans already understood something the rest of us had forgotten? Something their death world had been teaching them for tens of thousands of years? Because if survival truly belongs to the species that adapts fastest, then humanity may already be the most dangerous civilization in the galaxy.
and we had only just begun to see why.
There comes a moment in every empire's history when patience ends. For the Dominion, that moment arrived when humanity's influence began spreading faster than their fleets. For centuries, the Dominion had ruled through a simple principle: overwhelming force ensures obedience. Their armadas were legendary across the galaxy, vast formations of warships that darkened entire star systems when they arrived. Planets surrendered when Dominion fleets appeared in orbit. Civilizations collapsed long before the first bombardment. Resistance was rare. Victory was inevitable. Which is why the Dominion viewed humanity not as a rival, but as an infection. Human diplomats had begun appearing in territories the Dominion considered firmly under their influence. Trade agreements replaced resource monopolies. Independent colonies that once relied on Dominion protection suddenly gained alternative partners. Entire sectors were drifting beyond imperial control without a single battle being fought. To the Dominion High Command, this was unacceptable, and so they chose the simplest solution they knew. They would remove humanity from the equation. The declaration of war was brief. There were no negotiations, no warnings, no diplomatic ultimatums. Only a single transmission broadcast across human space: submit or be erased. Then the invasion fleets arrived. Even now, the recordings from those first days remain difficult to watch. Thousands of Dominion warships poured into human systems like a storm made of steel and plasma. Their formations stretched across orbital space, dwarfing every human defense fleet stationed there. The humans fought, of course. They always do. But this time, the imbalance was overwhelming. Planetary defense grids collapsed within hours. Orbital stations shattered under concentrated fire. Entire colonies burned beneath atmospheric bombardment. From the perspective of the Galactic Assembly, the outcome seemed painfully obvious. Humanity had finally encountered a force too large to resist. One by one, their outer colonies fell. Then their frontier worlds. Human fleets attempted counterattacks, but Dominion armadas destroyed them with brutal efficiency. By every measurable metric, the Dominion was winning. Within months, analysts predicted the complete collapse of human civilization. Even I believed it. The Dominion had mastered the art of conquest over thousands of years. Their war doctrine was brutally effective: destroy enemy fleets, occupy key worlds, enforce submission. Human defenses were simply not strong enough to stop them. But something strange happened after the first wave of victories. The war did not end. Instead of surrendering, humanity fractured. At first, Dominion commanders interpreted this as a sign of collapse. Human fleets began disappearing. Colonial governments stopped responding to communications. Entire regions of space seemed to fall silent. But the silence did not last, because what followed was something the Dominion had never encountered before. The humans stopped fighting as a unified empire and began fighting as thousands of independent networks. Civilian engineers infiltrated Dominion logistics databases, altering navigation algorithms and corrupting supply manifests. Merchant ships that once carried trade goods suddenly appeared armed with improvised weapon systems. Mining drones were reprogrammed into autonomous strike craft. Cargo vessels became stealth raiders. No central command structure existed for the Dominion to target, no singular fleet to destroy. Instead, small human units began appearing across Dominion-controlled territory like sparks in dry grass. A fuel deposit exploded in one system. A communication relay vanished in another. Navigation beacons guiding Dominion fleets began broadcasting false coordinates. At first, these incidents were dismissed as minor disruptions, but they multiplied. Human resistance networks learned quickly. Each sabotage operation revealed weaknesses in Dominion infrastructure. Each weakness created new opportunities. Within a year, Dominion fleets began encountering a problem they had never faced before: supply shortages. Their armadas still dominated every direct engagement. Whenever human ships gathered in large numbers, the Dominion crushed them without hesitation.
But those victories became meaningless when fleets ran out of fuel, or ammunition, or spare parts. Because somewhere, hidden among asteroid fields and abandoned stations, human operatives were dismantling the Dominion's logistical backbone piece by piece. Then the rebellions began. Worlds that had surrendered during the initial invasion started questioning their allegiance. Many had witnessed something unexpected during the occupation: human defiance. Despite losing battle after battle, humans continued resisting. They rebuilt destroyed infrastructure, smuggled supplies to occupied planets, shared technology with neutral civilizations caught in the conflict. To many observers, the Dominion looked powerful, but the humans looked relentless. And that difference mattered, because rebellion spreads through belief as much as opportunity. Soon, entire sectors began refusing Dominion commands. Local governments delayed resource shipments. Military outposts quietly withdrew support. Trade routes shifted away from imperial control. The Dominion High Command responded with predictable force. They deployed more fleets, more patrols, more planetary occupations. But every new system they conquered required additional resources to control, and every resource shipment became another target for human sabotage. Years passed. The Dominion still won every major battle. Human fleets still shattered when confronted directly, yet somehow the Dominion was losing the war. I remember the recording of the moment their leadership finally understood the truth. It occurred during an emergency session of their high command. Admirals argued over strategy while economic ministers reported collapsing supply chains. Finally, one older commander spoke. His voice was quiet, exhausted. "We made a fundamental error," he said. The room fell silent. "We attempted to conquer humanity the same way we conquer every other species." He gestured towards a holographic map filled with flickering conflict zones. "We destroyed their fleets, we captured their planets, we eliminated their military leadership." Another admiral interrupted. "And yet they continue fighting." The older commander nodded slowly. "Yes." Then he said something that would later be studied in military academies across the galaxy. "We misunderstood the nature of our enemy." He expanded the map, revealing thousands of scattered resistance operations across Dominion territory. They are not fighting as a civilization anymore. They are fighting as an idea. The room remained silent, because every strategist present understood the implication. Ideas cannot be conquered through bombardment. They cannot be destroyed by occupying territory. They cannot be eliminated by killing commanders. To defeat such an enemy, you must break the will that sustains them. And humanity's will had been forged on a world where survival itself required defiance. The Dominion had attempted to destroy human armies, but armies were never the source of human strength. Their strength was something far more dangerous. Every colony, every civilian ship, every individual human capable of choosing resistance. Which meant the Dominion had entered a war with a species that could not truly surrender. Because surrender requires a single authority to give the order. Humanity had none. By the time the Dominion finally realized this truth, the war had already changed them. Their economy was collapsing, their frontier systems were rebelling, their fleets, once feared across the galaxy, were stretched too thin to maintain control. The empire that attempted to crush humanity through overwhelming force now faced a terrifying possibility. They might not be able to win. Not because the humans were stronger, but because the humans refused to stop adapting. And when a war becomes a contest between rigid power and endless adaptation, history tends to favor the side that refuses to break. Which meant the Dominion's greatest mistake was not invading human space. It was assuming that defeating humanity required only military victory. Because by the time they realized the truth, they were no longer fighting an army. They were fighting a species. And that is a war almost no empire survives.
Empires usually fall loudly. History teaches us to recognize the signs: burning cities, shattered fleets, desperate last battles fought under dying stars. Collapse, when it comes, tends to announce itself with violence. But the transformation that followed the Dominion War did not arrive with explosions. It arrived quietly. So quietly that at first, almost no one noticed. Decades passed after the conflict ended. The Dominion, once the most feared military power in the Orion sectors, still existed, but it was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. Its fleets were smaller now, its borders more cautious. Humanity, meanwhile, should have been exhausted. Their colonies had been burned, their fleets shattered, entire systems had been reduced to rubble. Every military projection suggested they would require centuries to recover. But humans did not rebuild the way other civilizations did. They rebuilt faster, far faster. The first signs appeared along the old war fronts. Planets that had once been devastated battlefields suddenly began transmitting trade signals again. Orbital docks were reconstructed. Communication relays returned to operation. Entire planetary economies restarted within a fraction of the time analysts had predicted. At first, many believed the reports were exaggerated. Then we realized something astonishing. The reconstruction was not being done by a single government. It was being done by networks. Human engineers traveled between star systems offering reconstruction expertise. Merchant coalitions delivered raw materials to devastated colonies. Volunteer organizations, civilian groups with no official military authority, provided food shipments, medical infrastructure, and planetary stabilization technology. And they did not limit these efforts to human worlds. Former Dominion planets received assistance. Neutral systems received assistance. Even species that had once fought against humanity found human ships arriving in orbit, offering help. To many civilizations, this behavior was deeply confusing. Why would a species invest resources rebuilding former enemies? From a traditional strategic perspective, such generosity made little sense. But humans did not view reconstruction as charity. They viewed it as investment, because every rebuilt world became something valuable: a partner, a contributor, a participant in something larger. Within 20 years, the results were impossible to ignore. Trade routes expanded across the Orion frontier at a rate never before recorded in galactic history. New shipping corridors connected dozens of previously isolated civilizations. Technological exchange accelerated as research institutions from multiple species began collaborating on shared projects. Entire economic systems emerged that transcended traditional borders. None of it was controlled directly by humanity, and yet humans seemed to be everywhere within it. Human engineers designing orbital habitats, human negotiators facilitating trade agreements, human scientists leading cooperative research stations. It was as though they had woven themselves into the infrastructure of the entire region, not as rulers, but as catalysts. The most unsettling realization came during a particularly heated assembly session many years later. Several delegates had begun expressing concern about humanity's growing influence. "They are expanding without conquest," one representative argued. "They are creating dependencies," another warned. A third delegate raised a question that silenced the chamber. "Is this an empire?" At first, the suggestion sounded absurd. Empires require centralized authority, dominant military forces, clear territorial borders. Humanity possessed none of these. Their governments remained fragmented. Their fleets were still smaller than many established powers. They claimed no official control over the systems participating in their trade networks. But the influence was undeniable. Civilizations that once ignored each other now cooperated through human-designed economic systems. Scientific breakthroughs spread across species boundaries within years rather than centuries. Even military alliances began shifting. Humanity proposed something revolutionary. Instead of traditional military blocs built around dominance, they introduced cooperative defense agreements. If any member system was attacked, the others would provide support. But unlike traditional imperial protection systems, these alliances were voluntary. No species was forced to participate. And yet, many joined. Because the benefits were obvious. Shared intelligence, mutual protection, combined technological resources. Gradually, something unprecedented began to emerge across the frontier. A network of civilizations connected not by conquest, but by cooperation. For older empires, this development was deeply unsettling, because it challenged one of the galaxy's oldest assumptions. Power had always belonged to the species with the largest fleets, the strongest armies, the most territory. But humanity had demonstrated something different. Influence could spread faster than warships. Ideas could travel farther than armies. And systems built on cooperation could grow stronger than those built on domination. One analyst within the assembly eventually summarized the situation with uncomfortable clarity. If humanity wished to conquer the Orion frontier, she explained, they could not have chosen a more effective strategy. Her colleagues were stunned. "They're not conquering anyone," another delegate protested. The analyst nodded. "Yes," she said, "that is precisely why it is working. Because no species feared humanity's expansion. No fleets gathered to resist them. No alliances formed to contain them. Instead, civilizations willingly adopted the human systems that improved their economies, strengthened their defenses, and accelerated their scientific progress. And every time a new species joined those systems, human influence grew, not through force, but through participation." That was the moment the galaxy began to understand something profound. Humanity was not becoming the strongest military power. They were becoming something far more dangerous. They were becoming indispensable. Because once a civilization integrated into the human networks, leaving them became almost impossible. Trade routes depended on them. Scientific collaboration depended on them. Even planetary defense strategies increasingly relied on shared intelligence systems originally developed by human engineers. Every time a new species joined those systems, human influence grew, not through force, but through participation. That was the moment the galaxy began to understand something profound. Humanity was not becoming the strongest military power. They were becoming something far more dangerous. They were becoming indispensable. Because once a civilization integrated into the human networks, leaving them became almost impossible. Trade routes depended on them. Scientific collaboration depended on them. Even planetary defense strategies increasingly relied on shared intelligence systems originally developed by human engineers. Every time a new species joined those systems, human influence grew, not through force, but through participation. That was the moment the galaxy began to understand something profound. Humanity was not becoming the strongest military power. They were becoming something far more dangerous. They were becoming indispensable. Because once a civilization integrated into the human networks, leaving them became almost impossible. Trade routes depended on them. Scientific collaboration depended on them. Even planetary defense strategies increasingly relied on shared intelligence systems originally developed by human engineers. Every time a new species joined those systems, human influence grew, not through force, but through participation. That was the moment the galaxy began to understand something profound. Humanity was not becoming the strongest military power. They were becoming something far more dangerous. They were becoming indispensable. Because once a civilization integrated into the human networks, leaving them became almost impossible. Trade routes depended on them. Scientific collaboration depended on them. Even planetary defense strategies increasingly relied on shared intelligence systems originally developed by human engineers. Every time a new species joined those systems, human influence grew, not through force, but through participation. That was the moment the galaxy began to understand something profound. Humanity was not becoming the strongest military power.
They were becoming something far more dangerous. They were becoming indispensable. Because once a civilization integrated into the human networks, leaving them became almost impossible. Trade routes depended on them. Scientific collaboration depended on them. Even planetary defense strategies increasingly relied on shared intelligence systems originally developed by human engineers. Every time a new species joined those systems, human influence grew, not through force, but through participation. That was the moment the galaxy began to understand something profound. Humanity was not becoming the strongest military power. They were becoming something far more dangerous. They were becoming indispensable. Because once a civilization integrated into the human networks, leaving them became almost impossible.
For most of recorded galactic history, power was easy to measure. You counted fleets, you measured territory, you calculated the destructive capacity of a civilization's weapons. The equation was brutally simple. The species capable of destroying the most enemies ruled the stars. For thousands of years, this principle shaped every empire the Assembly had ever known. The strongest fleets expanded. The weaker civilizations submitted. Occasionally, coalitions formed to resist dominant powers, but even those alliances eventually fractured under pressure. Conflict was not merely common, it was expected. War was the natural language of power. That was the galaxy humanity entered when they first reached the stars. And at first, we assumed they would follow the same path as every species before them. After all, their early history appeared to support that assumption. Humanity had fought countless wars among themselves before achieving interstellar capability. Their planet had witnessed conflicts that devastated continents and reshaped entire political systems. From an external perspective, they seemed destined to become another militaristic empire, another rising power competing for dominance among the stars. But that is not what happened. Instead, something far stranger occurred. Humanity began redefining power itself. At first, most civilizations resisted the idea. Old empires viewed human diplomacy as weakness. Trade networks were dismissed as temporary arrangements. Shared research initiatives were considered naive experiments. Even the cooperative defense agreements humans promoted were initially treated with suspicion. Why would a civilization willingly share technology with potential rivals? Why allow smaller species access to advanced infrastructure? Why encourage economic independence among allies who might someday become competitors? These questions dominated early assembly debates about humanity's expanding influence. But the answers emerged slowly, through results. Worlds that joined human trade networks experienced unprecedented economic growth. Scientific collaborations accelerated technological development across multiple civilizations simultaneously. Shared defense systems deterred conflicts before they could escalate into wars. The benefits were undeniable. At first, only smaller civilizations embraced these changes. Species that had long existed under the shadow of larger empires saw an opportunity for independence through cooperation. But over time, even the oldest and most powerful empires began reconsidering their positions. The turning point came when one of the ancient stellar dynasties, an empire that had ruled its territory for over 5,000 years, experienced a crisis. Their infrastructure was aging. Their economy had stagnated. Several frontier systems were threatening rebellion. Traditionally, such problems would have been solved through military intervention, but by then, the galaxy had already witnessed the consequences of endless war. The dynasty's leaders chose an alternative approach. They contacted human diplomats. Within months, joint engineering teams were dispatched to repair failing orbital structures. Economic advisors helped restructure outdated trade monopolies. Scientific institutions from multiple species began sharing research data that revitalized the dynasty's technological sector. The transformation was remarkable. Within a decade, the empire that once feared collapse had become stronger than it had been in centuries, and they had achieved that renewal without conquering a single new world. Other civilizations began paying attention. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the galaxy started adapting to the human model. Trade agreements replaced territorial disputes. Research alliances connected laboratories across dozens of star systems.
Military cooperation agreements reduced the likelihood of large-scale conflicts. The changes were not immediate. Old habits rarely disappear quickly. There were still wars, still rivalries, still empires that clung to traditional doctrines of dominance. But something fundamental had shifted. The presence of humans' cooperative networks created alternatives to conquest. If a civilization needed resources, they could trade. If they faced technological limitations, they could collaborate. If they feared invasion, they could join defensive alliances. War was no longer the only solution. Over time, conflicts became rarer. Not because civilizations suddenly became peaceful, but because cooperation had become more profitable than conquest. And that realization reshaped the galaxy in ways none of us had predicted. Technological progress accelerated dramatically. Breakthroughs that once required centuries of isolated research now emerged within decades through shared collaboration. Medical technologies spread across species boundaries. Terraforming techniques transformed previously uninhabitable planets into thriving colonies. Entire sectors of space that had once been considered marginal became centers of innovation and commerce. All of this occurred without a central empire controlling the process, which raised an uncomfortable question among many assembly delegates. If humanity possessed so much influence, why had they never attempted to dominate the galaxy? After all, they had the opportunity. Their networks connected countless civilizations. Their diplomats were trusted across multiple species. Their engineers designed critical infrastructure for entire regions of space. If they wished to seize control, they could have done so gradually, quietly, without facing significant resistance. Yet they never tried. Instead, humans continued expanding the same cooperative systems they had introduced centuries earlier. More trade corridors, more research alliances, more defense agreements. When asked about this apparent lack of ambition, a human representative once gave an answer that puzzled many in the assembly. "We're not trying to rule the galaxy," she said simply. "We're trying to build something that outlasts us." At the time, many delegates dismissed the statement as philosophical rhetoric, but over the centuries that followed, it became clear that she had been entirely sincere. Humans were not interested in creating an empire. Empires eventually fall. They collapse under their own weight or are destroyed by rivals seeking dominance. Humanity appeared to be pursuing something else entirely. A system. A network of civilizations strong enough, adaptable enough, and interconnected enough to survive challenges that would destroy traditional empires. Such an ambition is difficult for many species to fully comprehend, because it requires a form of thinking rarely seen in galactic politics. Long-term thinking. Generational thinking. Thinking that measures success not by immediate dominance, but by the stability of the future. And yet, humans seem naturally inclined toward it. Perhaps that tendency was shaped by the harsh lessons of their death world. Perhaps it emerged from their long history of internal conflict. Or perhaps it is simply the way their species evolved to confront uncertainty. Whatever the origin, the result is undeniable. Humanity has changed the trajectory of galactic civilization. Where once power meant control, now it increasingly means influence. Where once fear ensured obedience, now cooperation ensures survival. Many civilizations once feared that humanity would dominate the galaxy. Now we understand something far more intriguing. Humans are not interested in ruling the stars. They're interested in building something larger than themselves, something no single species could create alone. And that ambition, unpredictable, hopeful, and relentlessly forward-moving, is far more powerful than any fleet ever assembled. Which leaves the rest of the galaxy with a choice. We can resist this transformation. We can cling to the old definitions of power. Or we can accept the possibility that humanity has discovered a better way to shape the future. Because one thing is certain, the humans are not finished building yet. And whatever they are creating, the entire galaxy will eventually become part of it.
I have addressed the Galactic Assembly for nearly 3 centuries. In that time, I have witnessed empires rise with terrifying speed and collapse just as quickly. I have seen fleets large enough to eclipse stars reduced to drifting wreckage. I have watched civilizations disappear because they believed their power would last forever. History in our galaxy is full of such lessons. Power, we once believed, belonged to the strongest, the largest fleets, the most destructive weapons. But if there is one truth the past centuries have revealed, it is this: strength alone does not shape the future. Ideas do. And the most dangerous idea the galaxy has ever encountered did not arrive with an armada. It arrived with a species called humanity. Today, human ships travel almost every known sector of space. Their trade vessels move between stars like the bloodstream of an enormous living organism, carrying resources, knowledge, and opportunity across civilizations that once barely communicated. Human diplomats mediate conflicts that once would have escalated into war. Human scientists lead research teams composed of species that centuries earlier would have refused even to share a room. And human engineers, well, human engineers have become legendary. Entire planets once classified as permanently hostile environments have been reshaped through human-led terraforming programs. Dead worlds now support thriving ecosystems. Asteroid belts have been transformed into habitats capable of sustaining billions of lives. From a purely technological perspective, humanity has achieved remarkable things. But technology is not their greatest legacy. The real transformation they brought to the galaxy is far more subtle. It is philosophical. Before humanity arrived among the stars, the galaxy followed a familiar pattern. Civilizations grew powerful. They expanded. Eventually, they collided with rivals. War followed. Victory reshaped the balance of power until the next conflict began. This cycle repeated endlessly. Empires rose and fell, but the underlying system never truly changed. Humanity introduced something different. They introduced the belief that power does not come from domination, it comes from transformation. At first, few civilizations took this idea seriously. Many believed humans were simply naive idealists, optimistic newcomers who had not yet learned the harsh realities of interstellar politics. But centuries have passed since those early judgments, and the results are difficult to ignore. Where humans establish trade networks, stagnation disappears. Where they build research alliances, technological progress accelerates. Where they mediate disputes, enemies sometimes become partners. This influence unsettles many species, because it does something no traditional empire ever achieved. It forces civilizations to reconsider their limitations. Humans have a strange habit of asking questions other species rarely consider. What if this system could work better? What if this conflict could be solved differently? What if this world could be transformed instead of abandoned? Such questions can be dangerous. They challenge assumptions that have guided civilizations for thousands of years. And once those assumptions begin to change, the consequences spread quickly. Entire governments evolve. Economic structures reorganize. Military doctrines shift. In other words, stagnation ends. Not everyone welcomes such disruption. There are still voices in the assembly who view humanity's influence with suspicion. Some fear their unpredictability. Others fear the long-term consequences of relying too heavily on human-designed systems. And in truth, those concerns are not entirely unreasonable. Humans are notoriously difficult to predict. Their societies evolve constantly. Their priorities shift, their strategies adapt. Even their own historians often struggle to explain how their civilization reached its current state. From a purely analytical perspective, this unusual power makes humanity one of the most unusual powers in galactic history. But it also makes them uniquely suited to confront the future. Because the future, as we have learned many times, is rarely predictable. Eventually, the galaxy will face challenges greater than political rivalries or territorial disputes. Unknown cosmic threats, environmental catastrophes, possibly even civilizations from beyond the borders of explored space. When that moment arrives, traditional empires may struggle to respond.
Rigid systems often collapse under unprecedented pressure. But humanity has spent its entire history preparing for the unexpected. Their species was born on a world where survival required constant adaptation. They built civilizations that evolved through chaos. They fought wars that forced them to reinvent themselves again and again. Every stage of their development has been shaped by the same fundamental lesson. When circumstances change, you must change with them. That philosophy now echoes across the galaxy, and perhaps that is the true legacy of humanity. Not their fleets, not their technologies, but the idea they introduced into the collective consciousness of interstellar civilization. The idea that the future is not something you conquer, it is something you build. Together. I look across this assembly chamber now at representatives from species that once fought bitter wars against one another. Today they share research, trade openly, coordinate defense strategies. None of this would have seemed possible centuries ago. Yet here we are, living inside a system humanity helped create. And I find myself wondering what historians in the distant future will say about this era. Perhaps they will describe it as the moment the galaxy matured, or the moment civilization finally learned to cooperate beyond species boundaries. But if they search for the origin of that transformation, they will eventually find it. Not in a battle, not in a treaty, but in the arrival of a young death-world species that refused to follow the rules everyone else accepted. A species that looked at the galaxy's ancient definition of power and decided it was incomplete. Because humans don't measure power the way we once did. They measure it by the number of worlds that grow stronger because they exist. Which is why their influence continues spreading, quietly, relentlessly, across every corner of explored space. After all, humans do not conquer worlds. They redefine what power means.